Perek Aleph of Ezra. We had Koresh's announcements, and the Posek tells us that this is Perek Aleph, Posek Hey, Vayakumu Rashi Ha'avos LiYehuda uBinyamin, the heads of the families of Yehuda and Binyamin, Va'kohanim V'Halevim, and L'chol Heir Elokim Es Rucho, and all of those who were inspired by God, Lalos, went up, Livnos Es Beis Hashem, to build the house of Hashem that's in Yerushalayim, and the people who didn't go gave them silver and gold and animals and food. So notice the four groups that are mentioned. Yehuda, Binyamin, meaning people from the tribe of Yehuda, people from the tribe of Binyamin, Kohanim, and Leviim. Why are these the only four groups that are mentioned? Very, very simple, although we'll see a contradiction shortly. Because remember that the northern kingdom of the 10 tribes had been exiled by Sancherib, the king of Assyria, more than 100 years before the Chorban. So by the time Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, the only groups that were in Eretz Yisrael were Shevet Yehuda, Shevet Binyamin, Kohanim, and Leviim. Now, it doesn't say how many went. The truth of the matter is, even of these four, only a small group went. But that's why it does not mention the other tribes, because the other tribes are nichlal in the northern kingdom of the 10 tribes. And then it mentions that Sheish Batzar, who is Daniel, was in charge of the Kalim of the Beis Hamikdash. Now, we move to Perek Beis, and the problem is, what's the connection between Perek Beis and Perek Aleph? Perek Beis is a detailed listing with exact numbers of the people who went up under the leadership of a man called Zerubbabel. So the question is, what is the relationship between Perek Aleph that talks about people coming under Shesh Betzar and Perek Beis that are describing people coming under Zerubbabel, in which Shesh Betzar is not even mentioned? So there is a big machlokas among the Meforshim how to learn the relationship between Perek Aleph and Perek Beis. Most Rishonim, and this appears to be Rashi's opinion, says it's all one thing, meaning to say Perek Aleph, Perek Beis are discussing the first wave of Olim, and it was under the leadership of Zerubbabel. I'll discuss him in a moment. And Sheish Betzar was very old. He was Daniel, and he was really given an honorary job. But it does not represent an earlier wave of Olim. And that's why there's no number that's given in Perek Aleph, because a number is given in Perek Beis, and if it's the same Aliyah, so Perek Beis tells me the number of Perek Aleph. However, other Meforshim actually learn there were two different waves. The initial wave was very, very, very small, so small that we're not even given a number. And that was under Sheish Betzar. And then a short time thereafter, maybe only a matter of months, a larger group of 40,000 people came under the leadership of Zerubbabel. So there's a machlokas exactly. Was Sheish Betzar the leader of a first wave of Olim, followed by the second wave of Perek Beis? Or is the description in Perek Beis simply an amplification of Perek Aleph, and in fact, Sheish Betzar never had a leadership position. He had the honor of being in charge of the Kalim of the Beis Hamikdash, and that's about it. Okay, so we'll go with Rashi, just to keep it simple, that Perek Beis is describing the actual first Aliyah, the first wave of Olim. And Perek Beis is a long chapter, and there's a lot of names, and people tend to get bored with unfamiliar names, and I understand that. But there's some very interesting things here. It's worthwhile to mine the data a little bit to learn about the different classifications. So first, if you look in Perek Beis, so we are told, Eila b'nei ha-medina ha'eila mishvi ha'gayla. The following are the names of the exiles that had been exiled by Nebuchadnezzar. This was 52 years before. Remember, this is 50 years after the Korban. And they returned. Now it says, Asher ba'u im Zerubbabel. They came with Zerubbabel. Other names are mentioned too, I'll get to. But Zerubbabel is number one. And it's remember, by the way, Ezra in the book of Ezra is not mentioned until more than halfway through the book. So Ezra is nowhere to be seen at this point. Chazal actually tell us that Ezra never went up with Zerubbabel. Ezra did not come with the first wave of Olim. Ezra came several years later because Ezra's Rebbe was still alive in Eretz Yisrael. Ezra's Rebbe was Baruch ben Neriah. Baruch ben Neriah was the secretary and assistant of Yirmiyahu Hanavi. And by this time, Baruch ben Neriah was too old and not well enough to make the trip. So Ezra did not come to Eretz Yisrael until his Rebbe, Baruch ben Neriah, died. So Ezra is not mentioned at all. But Zerubbabel is mentioned. And Zerubbabel is a bit of a murky figure, a bit of a mysterious figure, but an extremely, extremely important figure, although we're not told exactly why. In Ma'oz Sur, Ma'oz Sur is a poetic, we sing on Hanukkah, it's a poetic rendition of all the different exiles, the Mitzrayim, Babylonia, then Persia, then Greece, which is the Hanukkah story, and then Esav, Edom, Rome. So in the stanza about Bavel, it says, Kates Bavel, the end of the Babylonian exile was Zerubbabel, was the man Zerubbabel. So Zerubbabel was the leader of the group of Jews who came to Eretz Yisrael to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash and to settle the land. Chagai Hanavi, not in this book, but in the book of Chagai, clearly sees Zerubbabel as a potential Mashiach. And had more of the Jews come, perhaps he could have been the Mashiach. It turned out it didn't pan out, so it turned out just to be a relatively small group of people. And even when the Beis HaMikdash was constructed, until Herod's time, it was a small Beis HaMikdash as well. So there was a lot of Messianic dreams that were not fully realized because of the lack of participation of Am Yisrael. But Zerubbabel was the leader. Before Ezra, before Nehemiah, Zerubbabel was the leader. Now, who is Zerubbabel? Why does he have such a strange name? So we have to go back a little bit before the Chorban Beis HaMikdash. We had gone over some of this, but a little bit of a review would help. There was a very righteous king in the last decades of Malchus Yehuda, whose name was Yoshiu HaMelech. And Yoshiu tried to bring Klal Yisrael back to Tshuva. And he thought he was successful. L'maisa, he was not as successful as he thought because many people continued behind the doors in hypocrisy to worship Avodah Zarah. Yoshiu was killed in a military campaign against Paro. Paro was coming through his lands, Eretz Yisrael. Yoshiu tried to stop him. He was warned by the Navi Yirmiyahu not to fight him, but Yoshiu was killed. And from that time, there's only another 22 years until the Chorban. Things were going downhill. Yoshiu had one son, Yehoachaz, who only ruled for 3 months. And then he was succeeded by his brother, Yehoyachim, who was also a tremendous Rasha, who ruled for 11 years. Yehoyachim died and was succeeded by his son, Yehoyachim's son, Yoshiu's grandson. on again? Where's the other one? Oh, okay. Okay, so again, Yoshiu dies. Yehoachaz is king for 3 months. His brother Yehoyakim is king for 11 years. He dies. His son, Yoshiu's grandson, is Yehoyachin or Yechanya or Kinayahu, they're all the same name, who only rules for 3 months, but he's not killed. He is taken to Babylon and put in prison. And the last king of Yehuda is his uncle, who is Yoshiu's third son, Sidkio, who rules for 11 years. Right, so it's a relatively easy pattern. 3 months, 11 years, 3 months, 11 years. So from the death of Yoshiu till the Chorban Beis HaMikdash is 22 years and 6 months, 22 and a half years. Okay? Now, Yeshachanya, Yehoyachin, was taken to Babylon. He was imprisoned. And he was imprisoned for 37 years, meaning the temple was destroyed, meaning he remained in prison. Eventually, he was released to just die very shortly thereafter. Yoyachin was also said to be a Rasha. Yirmiyahu communicates from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that even if Yehoyachin would have been a signet ring on God's finger, something very close to God, God takes off the ring and throws it away. Yehoyachin was treated like a piece of garbage. He didn't even have the zechus to be killed. He just languished in prison for many, many years. At one point in his imprisonment, he was offered a conjugal visit with his wife. And prison in Babylonia, Babylonian prisons, were not like the federal penitentiaries that have, Wi-Fi and cable. Essentially, it was a pit in the ground. So his ability to be with his wife would mean they both would be standing, essentially. And as they're about to be intimate, Yehoyachin's wife says she sees some blood that would make her a nida. And for whatever reason, Yehoyachin did tshuva at that moment. He separated. He was not with his wife, although they had been separated for so long. And at that point, HaKadosh Baruch Hu forgave him. And at the next conjugal visit, she became pregnant. And Zerubbabel was either the son or the grandson, meaning there was a son before him. And Zerubbabel, the etymology of Zerubbabel is Zarua Bebavel. He was conceived in Babylon, although it may refer maybe to his father being conceived in Babylon in that prison. And one needs to know that this is the only remnant of the Davidic monarchy from which Mashiach will come. Tzidkiyahu was wiped out with all of his children. So the only surviving monarchy seed is the child of Yehoyachin, Zerubbabel. And Mashiach comes from, Zerubbabel could have been Mashiach, but Mashiach will come from Zerubbabel. And when the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva discusses the all-important idea of free will, and the Rambam says every person can decide to be as righteous as Moshe Rabbeinu or as evil as the first king of the 10 tribes, Yeravam ben Nevat, who not only sinned but caused other people to sin by the golden calves that he erected. When the Rambam is looking for an example of how tshuva can transform a person immediately, the very example he gives is Yehoyachin, who was so despised by the Almighty that God described him as a piece of garbage that he throws away, Yoyachin became the source of the Messianic redemption and Malchus based of it. So this is Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was the son, most say the grandson, of Yoyachin. Now Yoyachin at this particular time, Yoyachin is in prison. His grandfather, Zerubbabel's grandfather, is still alive. Yoyachin didn't die yet. He's languishing in prison, and yet his Enokel is more or less kind of like a king, although they're under the rule of Persia at this point. So this is Zerubbabel. So Zerubbabel is the manhig. Then it mentions some other people. Like this is the list of the manhigim. Zerubbabel. The second one is Yeshua. Now, when you hear Yeshua these days, you think of Messianic Jews or Christian missionaries or the like. But the truth of the matter is, Yeshua is a contraction of the name Yehoshua. And it does appear in the book of Ezra and the Divrei Hayamim. So Yeshua is a legitimate contraction for Yehoshua. And who is Yeshua or Yehoshua? So we know who he is as well. He was the first Kohen Gadol of the Second Temple. His full name is Yehoshua ben Yehotzadok. In fact, if you have a good memory, you don't have to remember too much, he was mentioned in last week's Haftarah. Last week's Haftarah, from the book of Zechariah. Remember, it's interesting, when you think about the book of Ezra, you should also be thinking about three other books: Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi. All of them are exactly the same time. They're going through the same thing. These are the last three prophets, Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, and they're coming back. They were the ones who came back to Eretz Yisrael with Zerubbabel. And particularly in the book of Chagai, but Zechariah as well, the two people that are most discussed are Zerubbabel and Yehoshua ben Yehotzadok, the Kohen Gadol. And these are the number 1 and 2 leaders of this wave of Olim, Zerubbabel and Yeshua. Sometimes he's called Yehoshua, sometimes called Yeshua. It's the same name. Now, just to remind you of the Haftarah, by the way, I hope you also recognize that the Haftarah for Parshas Baloscha is also the same Haftarah for Shabbos Chanukah, because Baloscha talks about lighting the menorah, Chanukah talks about menorah, and the vision in Zechariah is about a menorah. Remember the heavenly vision. Zechariah had a vision of a menorah being fed with olive oil from trees to olive trees, and the light is the light of the Shekhinah, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives the message, a very famous message, Lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach. It is not through physical strength or valor that you will succeed in life or in your mission. Ki im baruchi. It is only through my spirit. And there is a vision that Zechariah has, this is interesting, of Yehoshua ben Yehotzadok wearing filthy garments. And Hashem says, remove your filthy garments and put on beautiful garments. Now Chazal explained the whole backstory here, and that is, the children of Yehoshua ben Yehotzadok intermarried with non-Jewish women. And many people thought this was a taint and a shame for Yehoshua, and that disqualified him from being Kohen Gadol, because his kids went off the derech big time by intermarrying. And this was a prophecy from God that Yeshua himself was still a righteous person. That's an interesting perspective. This is always an issue that people discuss even today. If your kid goes off the derech, so parents naturally ask the question, what did we do wrong? That's the normal question. Now, the short answer is there's not one answer, meaning sometimes parents did do something wrong. It's not that, never something wrong, but sometimes they didn't. Human beings have free will, and there are different types of factors that act upon a person. And a person could be pushed in many, many directions for many, many different reasons. So obviously, parents would be sad, unhappy. They would pray, they would daven, they would do what they can. But it's not always appropriate for them to blame themselves because it's not necessarily anything that they did. Now, I don't mean it's never the case. Sometimes there is, unfortunately, negative factors that could have been avoided, but sometimes not. And one of the proofs to that idea is the fate of Yeshua ben Yotzadok, who Hashem confirms is a righteous and saintly person who is worthy to be the Kohen Gadol, and yet his children married non-Jewish women. So it happens, right? It happens. This is the mystery of why Hashem allows certain things to happen, but it's also connected to the notion of free will and autonomy. So the fact that you're born into a righteous family is not a guarantee you'll be righteous. And the fact that you're born into even an evil family, a Rishayim, is not a guarantee you'll be a Rasha. That goes back to the notion of free will. Every human being has the capacity to make these choices. Okay, so the first leader is Zerubbabel. The second leader is Yeshua, the Kohen Gadol. Again, he doesn't say he's the Kohen Gadol, but we know from Chagai, Yeshua ben Yehud is the Kohen Gadol. Now, the third is a curious name, Nehemiah. Now, as I say, Ezra is not on this list at all. Ezra did not come. But who is Nehemiah? So, obviously, the most logical thing you would think about is, all right, Nehemiah is Nehemiah, right? Nehemiah eventually becomes the political leader of the Jewish people in the book of Nehemiah. So, did he come with Zerubbabel? So here, too, we have a somewhat of a problem, because the book of Nehemiah begins with Nehemiah being the cupbearer, the one who serves, the butler, for the Persian king in Shushan. And he asks permission of the Persian king to go to Yerushalayim to visit his brethren. So we have a contradiction. Here it says Nehemiah went up in the days of Koresh under Zerubbabel, when in fact we see he did not go up until many years later. So how do you reconcile the contradiction? So once again, there are two ways of reconciling it. One way of reconciling it, which doesn't sound so plausible, is that the Nehemiah mentioned in Perek Beis is not the Nehemiah who became the leader. The Nehemiah who became the leader is still in Persia. And that's a little difficult because obviously if Nehemiah is mentioned in the number 3 position, this Nehemiah must have been a pretty important guy. But if you're not connecting him to the famous Nehemiah, then there's literally nothing else we know about him. In other words, he's now an obscure figure. The other alternative would be the same thing I said about Daniel. Chazal say Daniel was Sheshbetzar. Sheshbetzar came at the very beginning. So why is he in Shushan during the story of Purim? Because after the Binyan Beis Hamikdash was stopped, he moved to Shushan to be an intercessor. It could very well be Nehemiah was the same situation. Nehemiah initially came, but after the building of the Beis Hamikdash is stopped, he goes back to Persia. And then he returns later. Okay, so that's one way of understanding. Okay, so our top 3 are Zerubbabel, Yeshua, Nehemiah. Then Itaka mentions people that we don't know anything about. Soroya, Re'eloya. We don't really know anything. One can give some thought. You're going to come across in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, as well as Divrei Yamim, very strange names that nobody goes by today. And in fact, even in the Torah you have that. Look at the names of the Meraglim, or look at the names of the Nesiim. So some of the names we still use, but a lot of those names we don't use. Why do names drop out? And there are a lot of biblical names that are legitimate biblical Hebrew names that are not used. Now, Soraya happens to be a name. It's a very rare name, but it's occasionally used. In fact, there was a great Rav in Bnei Brak, Rav Soraya Devlitsky, Zichrono Livracha. His name was Soraya, but like he's the only one I know. So the name is not totally extinct, but it's kind of on the verge of extinction. Re'elaya, I don't know any Re'elayas. I don't know. So I don't have a real explanation why certain names just dropped out of the lexicon, but so be it. Okay, so Shreya Re'elaya I will not comment on, but the next one is fascinating. Another familiar name, Mordechai, and then it says Bilshan. Now, you could interpret it, Mordechai is a person and Bilshan is a person, but you'll see in a moment, Chazal interpret that Bilshan is an adjective describing Mordechai. Mordechai Bilshan. And Chazal say, interestingly enough, that this Mordechai is none other than the Mordechai of Megillas Esther. And he was one of the Olim with Zerubbabel. So once again, this raises the identical issue with Shesh Betzar. Because remember that the story of Purim is after Koresh. After Koresh dies, he is succeeded by Achashverosh, and that's the story of Purim. And Mordechai, during that story, is in Shushan. But why would Mordechai be in Shushan after Koresh dies in the reign of Achashverosh if Mordechai was one of the people who was with Zerubbabel? Answer, the same thing I said about Daniel, and I just said about possibly Nehemiah, we will say about Mordechai, that Mordechai moved back to Persia when the Binyan Beis HaMikdash was stopped, as we'll learn, in order to be an intercessor for the Jewish people. Now, Mordechai, too, is pretty old, around the age of Daniel, and let me go over this. 11 years before the Churban Beis HaMikdash, during the 3-month reign of Yehoyachin, there was the first wave of exiles, meaning Nebuchadnezzar exiled the Jewish people in 2 different stages. And these are called Galus Yehoyachin and Galus Sidkiyahu. And the gap between the two is 11 years, the 11-year reign of Sidkiyahu, because Yoyachin was only king for 3 months, then he was taken to prison. In Galus Yehoyachin, Nebuchadnezzar exiled, he didn't destroy the temple yet. They're still doing korbanos. But Nebuchadnezzar exiled a group of people that are called the Charash and the Masker. Now, literally, Charash means carpenters, and Masker means locksmiths. He exiled from the land carpenters and locksmiths. What did he have against carpenters and locksmiths? Just pshuto shel mikra. The short answer is these were skilled artisans who were capable of making weapons, spears, swords, arrows. So the carpenters and the locksmiths he got rid of because he didn't want them to be in Eretz Yisrael and possibly create weapons for an army. That's pshuto shel mikra. Chazal, however, have a drush that Charash and Maskir is a reference to Talmidei Chachamim. He exiled 11 years before the Churban Beis HaMikdash. The Chachamim, the sages, the wise people. Why are the Chachamim called Charash and Maskir? So the word Charash is like to be deaf or mute, deaf-mute. So it means that when the Chachamim spoke, you were like mute. You wouldn't be able to refute them in any way. And Maskir is when they spoke, the matter was closed. Everything was definitive. Now, Chazal say this was Hashem's hashgacha, that the Talmidei Chachamim would be an advanced party that came to Bavel, then Persia, eventually Persia, but initially Bavel, because Nebuchadnezzar, and they would establish a Torah community and yeshivos. So by the time the rest of the exiles come, there's already a regular Limud HaTorah system in effect. That's why Hashem wanted the Talmidei Chachamim to be an advanced party. But that does not really explain what was in Nebuchadnezzar's head. Nebuchadnezzar, what was he consciously thinking? I got to get rid of the Talmidei Chachamim or take them to Babel. Yeah, Hashem had a plan. But Nebuchadnezzar must have had a reason on his level why he was doing this. So it is a bit mysterious. Perhaps he regarded the Talmidei Chachamim as a leadership class. So potentially they could foment revolt. Be it as it may. Now, so once again, the galus of the Choresh and the Maskir is called galus Yoyachin. And this was 11 years before the Chorban Beis Hamikdash, which is called Galus Sidkiyahu. Okay? Now, when was Mordechai? Mordechai was a native Eretz Yisrael. When was Mordechai exiled? So the Posek says in Megillas Esther, Asher Hegla, now you'll understand this Posek. Asher Hegla Yerushalayim, Mordechai was exiled from Yerushalayim. Im Hagola, Asher Haglasa, with the exiles that were exiled. Im Yechaniah Melech Yehuda. Yechaniah and Yehoyachin are the same name. So a lot of people don't know what that's referring to, but now you know exactly. The Posek is telling us that Mordechai was a member of the Choresh and the Maskir, who was exiled in the days of Yehoyachin, in his brief 3-month reign, 11 years before the Chorban. That's what Megillas Esther tells us. Now, if he already was known as a Talmid Chacham, again, we don't have an exact age, but he was not a kid, right? Mordechai was Choresh and Maskir. Now, this was 11 years before the Chorban. The decree of Koresh is 52 years after the Chorban. 52 years. So if Mordechai is joining Zerubbabel, it's been 63 years since his exile, and then whatever age he was, you would add 63. Okay, I hope this is making sense in terms of the calculation. And then he went back to Persia, and that's when the Megillah happens. Okay, so he went from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, to Persia, then to Eretz Yisrael, then back to Persia. And once again, as far as we know, he died in Persia. Persia is Iran. In Iran, they have a tradition where Mordechai and Esther are buried. There is a tradition. They have a grave for Mordechai and Esther. So Mordechai, like Daniel, did not die in Eretz Yisrael, although both Daniel, under the name Sheshbetzar, and Mordechai were with Zerubbabel, but they went back to Persia, and they died there. Now Nehemiah, who also went back to Persia, did come back to Eretz Yisrael, but Mordechai and Daniel did not. Now, why is he called Bilshan? Mordechai Bilshan. What's Bilshan? So Bilshan, Chazal say, comes from the name Lashon. Mordechai was a member of the Sanhedrin, and to be a member of the Sanhedrin, you had to be familiar with 70 languages. You had to understand all of the languages of the, it's hard to believe, but all of the different languages. And therefore, Bilshan means a master of language. Baal Lashon. So even though in the simple reading of the verse, you could just as well read Bilshan as another person, we're listing names. Mordechai, Bilshan. Chazal understand that Bilshan is a modifier of Mordechai, and it's emphasizing he was a member of the Sanhedrin who mastered 70 Lashonos. Yeah.
Big questions. First do we know how much time was between this going up in the Purim story? And second, are these names listed in order of like their greatness or anything like that?
Yeah. So we 100% know how many years until the Purim story. This is a Koresh. I mean, basically, it's around. I have to look up. I have to figure out the exact number, but you're talking about around 15 years. So Purim story is going to be relatively soon. Yeah.
Rabbi, will the death of Yehoshua, is that then the start of the 70 years of exile?
The death of what?
The death of Yehoshua
Yeah.
when he dies after the war in Egypt, is that the start of the 70 years of exile?
No, it is not. The 70 years of exile starts from the destruction of the temple itself.
Okay.
We don't even count it from the first wave of exile. It's the Churban. Okay. Yeah. So this is Mordechai Bilshan. And now your second question, are these listed in order of importance? The short answer is seemingly yes. Although it's a chaval that we can't necessarily identify the importance of, Saraya and Re'elaya, they're listed ahead of Mordechai.
So were those members of the Sanhedrin also whoever was listed beforehand?
I think our assumption would be yes, but we don't know. Again, it's interesting. There are, to digress for a moment, we tend, let's say about Gedolim even, we tend to remember Gedolim only if they left Svarim. But the truth of the matter is, there were extremely great Gedolim who happened not to write anything, and they're virtually unknown, even though in their generation they were considered to be the greatest of the greatest of the greatest. So it happens to be the case if you don't leave over things. Sometimes the memories are not fully preserved, and we certainly can see that there are people in Nach that are mentioned, and by virtue of their placement, you could see they had extraordinary stature, and yet we cannot know nothing about them. So Mordechai is famous. We have the story of the Megillah. Daniel has the book of Daniel, etc. Zerubbabel is not so much famous for what he did. He's famous for the potential. In other words, Zerubbabel actually didn't seem to do a lot, but the Navi Chagai considered him to be Messianic material. So Zerubbabel is glorified primarily because of Chagai's vision. Other people we simply don't know anything about. Okay. Then it mentions other people, etc. Okay. So in terms of leadership, we have how many leaders? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right. So there are 10 leaders that are mentioned, and then it's going to give us a breakdown of how many from the different tribes came. Now, one thing you'll see, I'll talk about this tomorrow, is that although it seems that the only tribes that should come are Yehuda, Binyamin, Kohen, and Levi, because the 10 tribes were exiled, but in fact, we will see that there are remnants of other tribes that came as well. So let me just mention this idea. We talk about the lost 10 tribes, they're gone. And maybe when Mashiach comes, they'll be reunited. Maybe they're American Indians, maybe they're Vikings, but they're said to be lost. So that means a person might think, okay, I'm a Jew, and if I'm not a ger, meaning I have an unbroken line, then I must be either from Yehuda or Binyamin or a Kohen or a Levi. I can't be a Ruvain or Shimon or Gad or Asher, because those are the 10 tribes, and the 10 tribes were exiled and lost and never reunited. That's what a person might think. So I just want to point out that is incorrect thinking. Any Jew that's not a Kohen or a Levi could be from any tribe. You can be a Gad, you can be a Reuben, you can be a Shimon. We don't know, but you can be. And the reason is because although the kingdom of the 10 tribes was indeed destroyed, and the majority were taken into a permanent exile, Lamaisa, there always were, like immigration, there always were remnants of all the tribes that migrated to the south for Parnassa or whatever it is, or maybe even for religious reasons, because the northern kingdom was largely idolatrous. The southern kingdom had its ups and downs, but at least that was the Beis Hamikdash, etc. So one could easily imagine that if I'm from Ruvain or I'm from Yisachar, I might want to be closer to the Beis Hamikdash instead of being with the idolatrous kings of the north. So you have to understand that if you took a snapshot of Malchus Yehuda at the time of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, there would be people of every tribe there. Although the territory was Yehuda's territory and Binyamin's territory, but everybody was there. And the absolute proof for that is the Zerubbabel listing. In Perek Beis, we're going to see that although the majority of the populations that came back, a small number anyway, but the majority that did come back were Kohen, Levi, Yehuda, Binyamin, there are small numbers of all of the tribes that did come back. So therefore, the practical message to you is you can be any tribe, meaning you're not limited to, I mean, not that you can self-identify. I don't mean you can make up your tribe, but theoretically, we could be related to any tribe because the lost 10 tribes refers to the destruction of their kingdom. It does not refer to the obliteration of the individual identities. Okay, so we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.